Today, we're diving into the incredible story of how we, as a species, figured out how to take our own voices and send them flying through thin air. We're talking about crossing cities, oceans, and creating the very first true mass medium in human history.
I mean, think about it. It sounds like straight-up magic, right? One day, communication is stuck to the ground, limited by wires and roads. The next, it's just everywhere, all at once. So how on earth did we do it? How did we learn to speak to the entire world through the air itself? Well, that's the mystery we're going to solve.
To really get it, you have to picture the world before radio. It was a big, slow place. If you wanted to hear an orchestra, you had to physically be in the concert hall. News, well, that was yesterday's story, delivered in the morning paper. Then radio comes along and just shatters all of that. Suddenly, distance doesn't matter. The world's events, music, and news are piped directly into your living room, live. It wasn't just a new gadget. It was a total revolution in how we experience the world together.
Now here's what's so wild about this story. It doesn't start with some inventor tinkering in a garage. Nope, it starts with a physicist, a chalkboard, and an idea that was, for a long time, completely theoretical.
So, let's meet the guy who started it all, James Clerk Maxwell. In the mid-1800s, this Scottish physicist is scribbling away at these incredibly elegant equations. And what he finds is mind-blowing. He realizes that electricity and magnetism aren't separate forces, they're linked. And when they dance together, they create invisible waves that shoot out at the speed of light. For decades, this was just a ghost in the mathematical machine. A beautiful theory, but just a theory.
And then along comes Heinrich Hertz. In 1887, he puts this theory to the test with a brilliant and, honestly, a really simple experiment. He gets a spark to jump on one side of his lab, and then, across the room, with no wires, no connection whatsoever, a second spark magically appears on a receiver. Boom! He had just proven Maxwell's invisible waves were real. He'd sent energy through the air.
You'd think the guy who literally made the invisible visible would see the potential, right? Well, not exactly. In a classic case of famous last words, Hertz himself said he couldn't imagine any practical use for his discovery. He had no idea he just fired the starting pistol on an intense race to harness these waves and, change the entire world.
Okay, so the science is real, the waves exist. Now what? What do you do with them? This is where pure science crashes right into human ambition and engineering.
And this is where two absolute titans enter the scene. In one corner, you've got Nikola Tesla, the brilliant visionary dreamer who imagined a future with wireless power for the entire planet. And in the other corner, Guglielmo Marconi, a razor-sharp engineer and businessman who had one very practical goal in mind: sending Morse code without wires. He called it wireless telegraphy.
And in this race, it was Marconi's pragmatism that crossed the finish line first. On December 12, 1901, he did something that most people thought was completely impossible. He sent a single signal, just the letter S in Morse code, from England all the way to Canada. We're talking 3,500 kilometers across the Atlantic Ocean. The world was absolutely floored. This proved these waves could connect not just a room, but entire continents.
But here's the thing. Marconi's incredible achievement was still just dots and dashes. Beep, boop, beep. The next great leap forward wasn't about going farther. It was about sending something infinitely more complex. It was about sending the human voice.
So how'd they crack this problem? Well, Marconi's system was basically a light switch. It's either on or it's off. You can't exactly broadcast a piece of music with that. The big breakthrough came from a Canadian inventor named Reginald Fessenden. His idea was pure genius. First, he created a continuous, steady wave. He called it a carrier wave. Then he figured out how to make the sound waves from his voice actually change or modulate that carrier wave. It's like he made his voice surf on top of that invisible signal.
And all of this incredible science comes to a head on one single night, Christmas Eve, 1906. From his broadcast station in Massachusetts, Fessenden did it. He spoke into a microphone, played a bit of music on his violin, and conducted what we now consider the very first public radio broadcast in history.
Now you gotta put yourself in the shoes of a wireless operator on a ship that night. All you've ever heard through your headphones is the cold, sterile beep 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 of Morse code, and then, out of the crackle and the static, comes a man's voice. And the violin. It was so completely unheard of, so unbelievable, that many sailors wrote in their logs that they thought they were hearing the voices of angels.
So the technology is there, but for a while it was still kind of a niche thing for hobbyists and the military. The next, and maybe the biggest step, was taking radio out of the labs and putting it right into everyone's homes, creating this kind of electronic campfire for the whole nation to gather round.
The vision for this came from a young guy named David Sarnoff. In 1916, he writes this memo that's now legendary, proposing what he called a radio music box. He predicted that this thing could become a common household item, just like a piano. And his bosses? They thought he was completely crazy.
But Sarnoff was about to be proven right in a big way. The real tipping point was November 2nd, 1920. A little station in Pittsburgh, KDKA, does something nobody had ever done before. They broadcast the live results of the presidential election. For the very first time, people didn't have to wait until the next morning to read about it. They heard history happen as it happened. And just like that, the radio craze was on.
The 1930s and 40s were truly the golden age of radio, and it showed its incredible power. It could bring a whole country together, like when President Roosevelt's fireside chats calmed the nation's fears. But it could also cause pure panic. The 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles was so realistic it convinced thousands of people that Martians were actually invading. And of course, during World War II, it became an absolutely essential tool for news, morale, and propaganda. But then, in the 1950s, a new box with pictures shows up in the living room, television. And this looked like the knockout punch. Everyone, and I mean everyone, thought radio was toast. Why would you just listen when you could watch? It seemed like the end was near.
So the big question is, did it? Did TV really kill the radio star?
And the answer, amazingly, is no. Not even close. Radio didn't die. It did something much smarter. It reinvented itself. It stopped being the piece of furniture the entire family huddled around and became your own personal companion.
You can see this amazing evolution right here. First, in the 50s, you get the transistor. Bam! Radio is no longer furniture. It's portable. You can take it to the beach. Then in the 60s, it moves into our cars and becomes the essential soundtrack for our lives on the go. And today, well, the spirit of radio is right here, right now, in your ears. The podcast is the direct descendant of that very first magical Christmas broadcast. It's radio on demand. So from a crazy theory on a chalkboard to a global network to the device in your pocket, the story of radio is all about making the invisible indispensable. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's the next invisible wave being dreamed up right now that's going to completely change our world tomorrow?